So, good morning, everyone. So, today is our online session for Programming 2. So, in today's discussion, so our topic is focuses on the following. So, objectives. So, number one, we will be having a review of the concepts of the programming structures because I read some comments while checking your activities, discussion, questions, and comments. So, may only few are still trying to understand what the structure is or what are those structures, different structures in programming. So, we will try to review this. Significance of applying loop structure. So, this is the topic that I have provided in our week 6 module. We're going to discuss how to define while loop structure and also different types of loops. But I'm not going to discuss the contents of the entire module. I'm just going to describe or explain some important things that you should know, although this is also part of our module. And also, we're going to identify the syntax for our for loop and do while, because in our previous module I only mentioned while loop. I did not provide a complete discussion of loop because that's maybe too much content for you to read in module 6. That's why I remove it from module 6. So what I did, I just defined while loop and types of loops, and I mentioned the different types of while loops, the sentinel, and etc. So in this lecture, we are going to identify the syntax or review the syntax of for loop, although this is also discussed in your programming 1, but we will revisit it again. And the do while loop, of course. So we will try to identify the differences between these loops and what are those differences. Also, aside from that, we will also be discussing the difference between break and continue statements. Some of you are not familiar with break and continue. In my experience, I usually use this one depending on the situation. So later we will be identifying what those situations are. And of course, aside from that, we'll be discussing the nested loops. In our module in conditional statements or selection structure, we identify nested conditions. So in loop, we can also apply nested loops. And we will be discovering how we are going to construct C++ statements that applies nested looping. And of course, as an additional topic on today's lecture, we will also discussing on array. I understand that some of you have already background of array because I think it's already covered in programming 1, but we will visit it again because by next module, maybe on the next period, we'll be discussing new topic, and what we are doing right now is we will just reviewing the concepts and activities that you have done in programming 1. So hindi pa tayo nagsisimula. So the start of our topic is on the next period. So we will start on functions and etc. So let's start. Okay. Now, let me review about this structure. If you notice, I have different diagram here because I want to at least for you to become familiar. And I didn't use flowchart. Instead of flowchart, I use this diagrams for you to be able to easily identify the difference between these 3 sequences. Actually, there are actually 4, so I only mentioned 3. The fourth structure is module. Ano po? Module. Ibig sabihin, there is a certain block. separated from another block. In your programming one, you only focus on the main block of a C++ program, but in our subject, we'll be dealing with different blocks. So that's what you call function. So we'll be dealing with that by next period. Okay, let's focus in these three fundamental concepts of programming structure. So we have sequence, selections, and loops. So these are the fundamental structure that a new programmer should know, and how to apply this in different situations. In some cases, there are programs that only apply sequences. There are some cases that you apply both sequence and selections, and there are some cases you mix the three fundamental structures. So it's very important that you are familiar with this one, because in the next activities, you will be majority of activities, you will be dealing with these three at the same time. Okay, so sequence, the basic. So sequence is a series of actions. Basically, when we say sequence, these are step-by-step block of statements. So when we say sequence, there are actually a numbered arrangement. So from action 1 to action 2 to action 3 and so on. So until the sequence has been carried out. So that is the sequence structure. So the purpose of doing this is for us to be able to identify the proper steps of executing the statements of our program. So remember, when you define sequence, it must be you should identify the proper sequence, because when your program provides an ordered sequence, the instructions is also an order. That's the basic idea of it. So for example, so we have this basic C++ program that calculates a balance of a certain customer. So we have a sequential structure. So this is the basic one. So we have the declaration of variables and the input output. So if you have did not provide proper sequence of your program, so it will cause some logical error, especially logical error, because that's very hard to track if you have logical error, which means there are certain sequence that did not follow correctly. That's why sequence is very important. So we have the constant variable, but anyway, this is incomplete, so you need to have data type here, so I forgot. And you have the sequence for displaying the message from the user, what to do, and the input. So variables can be declared anywhere in your program or inside the block. So as you notice, declared after a few statements, and of course the implementation of statement or expression that produce calculations. Okay. By the way, be careful of writing expression like this one. It's important that if you are going to identify what you call this outcome of a certain calculation that produce decimal or real numbers, make sure you provide a proper data type. And if ever your variable has let's say the first variable is an integer type and the second variable is a decimal type, so the outcome of that is decimal. So we have a certain discussion in our module called casting, wherein you can convert your data type to another type, because there are certain differences between the calculation if you did not use proper data type correctly. There are slight differences in decimal points. In a way, some of you might notice it because of some examples that I provided in activities. There are different programs that has different or slight differences in decimal points. So please use proper data type. So what are the things to consider in using data type? First thing you need to consider is the outcome of that expression. It may have, are they required to produce decimals, how many decimal points, and etc. Of course, the cout, so to produce the outcome of your program. So you have concatenation here. When you see concatenation, you are mixing the string to another type, which is this one is a double type. So when you run this program, it will produce a message with a result of calculation. So next is selection. So when your program requires to choose a certain block depending on situations, that's the time you use selection. It's like putting a decision mechanism in your program, what to perform or what block to execute in your program. It's like walking around the corner and you find yourself deciding which one you need to choose. That's what selection structure is all about. You are allowing your program to identify a specific statement depending on situation. When you say depending on situation, you provide condition that you need to satisfy. If the condition is true, then path number 1 is being executed. Otherwise, the other path is executed. So that's why we have selection structure. So the difference between selection and sequence is that sequence, majority of your block is executed, while selection, there is a possible of reordering of statements. When we say reordering, not all of your block is executed. Instead, you only select block depending on the condition that you provided. Remember, when you use selection structure, it's important that you identify the proper condition that you need to add in your if block so that the proper statement is being chosen by the code to be executed. So the selection structure is a conditional statement that are features of programming language which perform different computations or actions. So there is a certain what you call this idea, or there is a certain identification of block that needs to be executed depending on the condition. So in selection or conditional statement, you actually define a Boolean expressions, which means the outcome of that is always true or false. So if the condition is false or if the condition is true. Okay, what are the different types of conditional statement? Some of you submitted activities, medyo, I'm not sure kung if you're already familiar with it, but when you create conditional statement, it's not actually necessary to provide else block on it, because we have single alternative. When we say single alternative, it's just an optional block that you need to execute if the condition is met. So in this example, we have a single alternative and a binary selection. When you say single alternative, as you notice in this flow chart, you only execute this block here. Let me change my pencil. If your condition is true, then your code will execute, or your program will execute this particular block here, as many statements as you like in this particular process. But it's somewhat like optional, because your program will only execute this again if the condition is met. If not, then it will continue processing the next statements. So it's like an optional block of your program. Okay, so while the binary selection or the dual alternative, I mentioned this on my module, this is a dual alternative. I just call it binary because we have two separate process that cannot be executed at a time. So which means binary, you only have to choose one. So it's either this one, if your condition is true, or this one, if your condition is false. So it's like choosing a path between two roads. So you are not allowed to choose two paths, instead only one. So after executing after you met the conditions, or a certain block is executed, then you are bound to the next statements. So the other block is kumbaga, it's being ignored. Okay, so that's why we have these two particular process. So yun. So again, practice writing conditions, because I notice some of you are not good in writing conditions, but you have to think of a condition like this way. It's like what you do every day, making decisions. So but the difference is you're just making a decision based on a particular requirements of the program, like is my data range from 1 to 10, or is my data is true or false, something like that. My suggestion is to read books, or browse examples online. It's really easy to browse examples because some websites provide large amount of state or examples that can be examined. And when you uh, browse online, there are plenty of websites that offers examples already. And one of the site that I usually visit is Double Schools, because there are lessons for C++ there. If I have difficulties on my program, I usually uh, visit Stack Overflow, because professional programmers usually visit there to provide assistance for programmers who needs their help. So there are plenty of codes there. The only thing that you need to know is how to read those codes and familiarize their solutions. Okay. Okay, next. Okay, next, aside from the first two figures or types, we have multi-branch. When you say multi-branch, so it's multiple process that needs to be identified, or needs to choose by your program depending on the condition. So in this first figure, we have this multi-branch statement as multiple processes that needs to be executed depending on the condition. So it's like binary, but we have a lot of process that needs to be executed. So it will be process 1, only one process depending on the condition. So in this case, we have a default. By the way, when you construct conditional statement, you need to identify how many processes do I need to process. For example, you have 4 processes, which means you only need to construct 3 conditions, because the remaining one is intended for else part, or the default part. They understand that? What I mean is, let's say for example you have 4 processes. So when you have 4 processes that needs to be executed depending on the condition, you only need to construct 3 if statement. So else if, by the way, else if, so something like that, because this one is intended for else. So no need to construct any condition for this one. Okay, because I notice some students always provide, or always identify conditions in the else part, wala na siyang nilalagay. So that's what I noticed, but only few students practices that. But you know, it's really important to identify the proper way of using this particular block. Anyway, erase natin. Okay, so how do we use multi-branch? So we have different syntax for that. We have if, else block. And also, aside from that, we have a switch case statement. So let's take, for example, this next figure in our slide. So what's the difference between switch and if else? Well, the difference is, number one, if else statements requires condition. So, yeah. While switch, it requires a statement that you need to identify based on the cases. I usually mention parang it's like a pattern matching. No? The value of the statement in your switch matches the value of the case, then that process will be chosen. Uh, when do we need to apply if else block, or if block and switch? You need to apply this block if, this is reason number 2, if there are conditions that should be met. Example, range. If you are not certain what value the user will input in your program, and you need to choose or identify the input if satisfy a certain condition, then you need to choose if else. But if your program requires user to input a fixed data, let's say for example, the user need to choose between red, blue, and green, then I suggest choose switch statement because you have a fixed block or fixed choices. So that's the application of, or the difference between the two. Some people use, I intend to use switch because it's easier than condition, because I will, it's not requiring me to use conditions. But in my case, I suggest is to consider the application of or the difference between the two blocks. Again, you use if statement if there is a condition that should be met, while switch, you need to match the contents of the variable. You need to match it with the cases that you need to identify. Okay, I hope that's clear enough. But logically, somewhat they are similar but different on how you apply them. So I hope it's clear enough to for you to be able to identify when to use them both. Okay. Sometimes, if the program requires me to identify unknown data, so I usually use if else statement, because if those data is not false between my condition, so it will be directed to my false part right here. But if the user choose between a data and requires me to identify which data is being chosen, so I use this one, the switch case. Anyway, just the purpose of this lecture is for you to have a clear understanding of the block. It depends upon you, of course. There are several programmers that usually use if else instead of switch, but it's very important for you to have this background. Para mas, in the implementation of the block, when to use them. Now, let's have some example. Okay, so this is the single alternative. So this is one I mentioned a while ago. So notice, in this example, my if block, this is an example program that allows the user to compute if a customer will be granted a discount, but if not, so it will be optional part. So notice, we have this if block here, that if the total amount of reaches more than 500, so they will be computed with discount. Otherwise, nothing happens. We just proceed with the next block. So it means this is optional part. Okay, so that is the single alternative. Okay, some of you might use this one. So ako, in terms of my experience, okay, I usually use this one depending on the situation, of course. Another example is a binary selection, or the dual alternative. So we have two alternative paths here. So when this condition is met, so therefore this one executed. After executing this one, it will go directly at the end of your program. So if there are statements here below, so it will be executed. Notice, the statements in the else parts will be discarded. Okay? So these are two situations that can be identified depending on the condition. So this is situation 1, situation 2. Okay? So if there are several statements inside, you need to enclose it with a curly brace. Without a curly brace, only first statement will be executed inside the block. The other statements are discarded. So it's really important that you know how to use the curly brace or when to use them. Okay? So curly braces defines a block of statements. So when you create a block, make sure if they are belong to the same block, you need to close or you need to use curly braces, especially when you use conditionals, the looping, etc. Okay, next. This is now multi-way. So as I mentioned a while ago, if there are three, this is the first process, second process, third process. If your program requires to identify or select between those three processes, you need to choose or use conditional statement. But you notice, we only have two conditions because the other block is intended for else part. So no need to put conditions there. So that's the primary purpose of what I mentioned a while ago, that if you have three possible statements, you need to construct only two conditions. Okay, so there are plenty of examples in our module, so go back to them if this discussion is there unclear in your part. But anyway, so by the way, conditions, so you can apply multiple conditions here using the logical expression, the and, not, and, or. So in review, and conditions is used to combine two or more conditions. So if you use and, you try to identify that the condition should be met, all conditions should be true in order to make the path true is executed. While or, only one true statement should be required to become or only one true path or only one condition is required to make the true path possible. So that's the difference between and or. Okay, next. Okay, nested. So nested statement is actually important in your programming. Nested statement is just branching several conditions together. So as you can see in my example, I allow the user to input a numeric data. So if the number inputted is not equal to 0, so which means if the input is 1 and above, so we'll be executing this block here. If not, this one will be executed. But notice inside the block there is also a condition. So if the number is divisible by 2, which means we are trying to identify the modulus or remainder. Number, it's like number divided by 2, we are after the remainder. So we are looking for the remainder. So that's the purpose of modulus. Okay? And modulus is applied, or the result of modulus is always integer. Hindi siya nagre-result ng decimal. So it's always integer. Okay? Yun. Which means if you divide 10 by 3, it's not 3.333 or What I mean is 1 point some or 0.333 something. No, it's always what? Integer. Okay, so that's the purpose of modulus. Okay, now there are several cases that nested is several block is being nested inside the conditional statement. So depending on situation, you might encounter that in the future activities. But of course, it's really important that you already familiar on how to apply this one or this particular block. Okay, so in this example, this one is what you call the inner structure of your conditional statement. Okay, so notice nyo, that's the difference between the two. Okay, this is now a switch statement. So as I have mentioned a while ago, we only use if statement if there are conditions that should be met. Which means sometimes things are unknown, so you need to put condition. But if choices are present or made or already defined, let's say for example, the user needs to choose between addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. So this already defined. So my advice is to use switch statement because the value of operator depends upon the user input. So if the user inputted the plus character, so it will proceed to this block. Okay, if not, so it will match other cases. Match. If no match has been found, therefore it's an error. So notice we only have 4 choices, but in our case we have 5 cases. The first 4 choices and the default, which is the error part. Okay, so that's how you construct a proper case statement or switch statement. You always provide default to ensure that in any case that the user inputs a undefined data, it will be, your program will provide message that, hey, you inputted incorrect one. So just provide them a message rather than allowing your program to crash or do some runtime error. Okay, so that's the purpose of switch statement. Okay, so yun. Next, by the way, don't forget to use break. If you forget to use break, which means once your program executes this one, it also executes the same case because you did not provide break. Break allows you to allows your block to terminate the remaining block. Okay. Okay, now looping. So looping. Okay, now I just let me continue. So repetition structure. So one of the structure of programming is repetition. So it also known as looping or iteration, which means looping is the process of repeatedly executing one or more statements. Why do we need this one? The reason is, and majority of program nowadays requires lots and lots of statements, and some of those statements are a repetition of several tasks. So in order to minimize your effort writing tasks with similar statements, loop is being applied. Okay, let's say for example you are trying to develop a program for a robot, and the robot needs to travel from one place to another place. So this is the end. So notice the robot needs to do some forward steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And of course, our robot has only 2 legs. So therefore, when he performs forward motion, he needs to perform left, for example, right, left, right, and so on. Now notice the pattern. So we only have two possible particular steps that the robot needs to perform. Using loop allows us to execute this multiple times instead of writing it manually multiple times. So instead of doing this, what I'm doing right now is writing the steps that the robot needs to perform. It's couple times consuming, and notice it's a repetition of the process. So using loop allows you to repeat this process 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. That's the purpose of loop. Okay? So it's like making the block repeat until a certain is met. Something like that. So you need to repeat 5 times. So left plus 5. Something like that. So it's a very simple statement, but it will achieve the same purpose going to the end of the line. Okay, so that's the purpose of looping. Now, another usefulness about this one is it minimizes our program. So if your program, sometimes it happens, has a logical error, it's really hard to debug program with lots and lots of codes in your screen. So minimizing your code, optimizing them allows you to easily debug your program. Okay. Now, next. So, we have actually two types of loops. Okay, we have pre-test loop and post-test loop. In my previous module, I only mentioned pre-test. When you say pre-test, you ask first the condition before executing the process or the block of or the body of loop. While the post-test, you execute first the body of loop before asking a question or the condition. That's the difference. Which means, in the post-test loop, you always execute at least one. Okay? So, that's the difference. It's the reverse of pre-test. That's why it's called post-test, because you first execute the block before you check if the condition is correct. Okay, if not, then it will end. But in pre-test, the block here is executed if this condition is met. Now, when do we use this? Let's say, for example, when you write message to your cell phone, diba, you usually type the message first before sending them. And when you send, the phone actually performs checking if you have load. So that's post-test, diba? So post-test means you execute a certain action before checking if the condition is met, something like that. Okay, so that's the application of post-test. If your block requires to met condition first, then you need to choose pre-test. So let us explore structures that applies the two types of loop. Okay, so in pre-test loops we have while loop and we have for loop, while post-test loop we have do while. Notice the while you need to do first before checking. So that's the or checking the condition. Sorry, there is nothing. Okay. Condition. Okay. Okay, condition. So the while loop and for loop always check your condition before executing the block. Okay, let's explore them one by one. Okay, so the pre-test loop is the loop condition is tested before entering the loop, while the post-test, the test of the loop condition occurs after the body of the loop is executed or carried out. So the statements in the body of loop are always executed at least one time. Okay? So, yeah. So this is an example of while loop. So while loop, so we have a variable int I initialized to 1. So if I, which is 1, so this is not the value of I, so I have value of 1. Is 1 less than 5? Basically, yes. So, therefore, it will execute printing the value of I. So, 1. Then, we add. Okay, by the way, what is the difference between plus I and I plus? Actually, they both increment the value of I 1. But, their difference is I plus I, this is pre-increment, which means when you display the value of I with plus I, for example, the value of I is 2. When you execute plus I, the output of this is 3. Okay? But if you choose to execute, let me erase this one. But if you write the statement like I plus, this is now different. Why? I plus means the increment of 1 occurs after executing the statement. So therefore, in this example, the value of I is 2. Why 2? Yes, sir. You mentioned a while ago that it actually increments 1. Yes, it actually increments 1, but in this statement, you display it before it increments to 1. So this one is pre-increment, this one is post-increment. When you say post-increment, you increment after it is executed. So if ever you write another statement, for example, if ever you write another statement like cout, like this one, and I, something like that. So the output of this is 2, and the output of this will become now 3, because this line is executed, so therefore the incrementation happened after this one is executed. So therefore, when you execute this one, it now become 3. Gets na? Okay, I hope you understand that. Please take note if you have questions. Okay. Okay, so let's go back. I hope this is clear. Okay, erase na natin. Okay, now, let's go back to this one. So, in our first statement, so now, plus I, so this will become, this now becomes 2, because it actually incremented. Okay? This now is 2. So, after incrementing by 1, it will go back to this one, asking another. Is 2 less than 5? Yes, until it reaches 6. Okay? So, therefore, if reaches number 6, this now become false. So, it will be going out of the loop and program ends. So, that's the purpose of while loop. It will ask first the condition before execute the statements or block of statement inside the loop. Okay? Now, let's move forward. Okay. Another example is for loop. Hello? Still there? Nandiyan po ba kayo?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Somewhat po, sir.
Sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, for loop. Okay, for loop is different because
Sir, may
in
ano
while
po
loop,
kami.
yes. Mamaya na yung question. Okay.
Hindi po, sir. May
May nagjo-join pero hindi ko sila ma-accept kasi naghang ata. Wait lang. But anyway, recorded naman to, so okay lang naman. But anyway, okay, the difference between while loop and for loop is that for loop actually provides important statements. As you notice in while loop, let's go back to while loop. Okay. Okay, let's erase this one. Important statements of loops are the following. Number one, the loop should have, number one is condition, this one. Number two is statements that to be executed. And number three, this one, your control variable. This is what we call controller. Let's call it controller or control variable, or let's call it counter. The purpose of doing this is for us to be able to identify if we still met this condition. So it's important that you always write this statement inside your loop to update the value of I, so that when time comes, this will become false. We will be going out in the loop, because if you don't do this, your loop will become infinite. Okay, so that's the primary purpose of this control variable here. Now let's go forward. While for loop, this is different, because in for loop you have this initialization. The same with the while loop, you have initialization. So we have the condition. This word, the condition. Initialization is this one is our incrementation, something like that, increment. Okay, so this is now your statement. So it's like we reorder the statements of while loop, but you know, for loop and while loop are the same, but they have different structure. Sir, when do we use while loop and when do we use for loop? This is very straightforward. Now, when you use while loop, we use while loop if, number one, there are certain statements that should be implemented before incrementing the value of control variable. For loop requires you to, every time that you run the statement, it actually increments at the same time. Now, there are certain cases that we apply this one. Why? Example, I need to ask the user to input a certain number of data, but when a certain value is met, I need to exit from the loop. For example, I need to allow the user to input number like 3, 2, 5, 6, 7. For example, this one is the magic number, number 6. I don't want this to happen, or I don't want the user to enter number 6. So when the user inputs the number, so pwede kong, I can implement a break statement that allows me to exit the loop if the user inputs number 6. You can't do that although you can implement that in for loop, but it's, you know, convenient to use while loop rather than for loop in this situation, something like that. You know, it's for you to be able to decide, you could, depending on convenience, when to use them. Okay, but in my case, still, since I am familiar with this block, so it depends on certain situation that when to use them. Okay, so in this case, I have this for the example. So okay, if you have questions later, we will try to wait lang, hindi ko man yung iba. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so this is our do while. Now this is a post test, which means your loop, your loop is executed, your loop is executed at least once before it asks if the condition is met. So which means your this type of loop executes the body first before, checking if the conditions are met. It also has the same statements like the condition, the increment, and the statements. So when to use them? Example, there are some cases that the user needs to, let's say for example, perform addition, like please input a number, first number, let's say for example, please input first number, second number, let's say 2 3. Do you want to continue? Yes or no? You put yes. So in this case, this block is in the body of the do while because you asked the number first before checking if they want to continue for another round of inputs. So that's the purpose of do while. The intention of this is to execute a block first before asking a condition or asking a questions from the user to continue or not to continue executing the code, something like that. So that's the purpose of do while. Okay, so I will be providing this example in my next activity. Okay, para hindi kayo masyadong ma-confuse kasi there are actually several examples that you can identify in the internet, but sometimes it actually confusing because there are too many. But as much as possible, I'm preparing activities that are easier for you to understand. Okay, eto, break. Break or continue. Okay, medyo natuwa lang ako sa illustration. Okay, break. When do we use break? The break statement terminates the loop when it is encountered. There are some cases in loop that allows us to break the execution if the conditions are met. Later I will provide an example. And what is continue? The continue is the statement that is used to skip the current iteration. You want to skip because you want to continue to the next iteration. In a loop, all the body of the loop is executed. Let's say for example, when you execute this one, all the contents of this one are executed, right? Yes. Now, what if there are some cases that when a sequence or input is encountered, I need to skip those iteration and return to another set, something like that. That's the purpose of continue. Okay, again, you are applying a condition here. Okay, so that's the purpose of continue. We already encountered break statements in switch. Okay, also continue allows us to identify the next iteration. Okay, so let's proceed. Example. Okay, notice in this example we have a program that asks a number. As you notice, this is always true. When we say true, it terminates until we break or create a break statement inside the body of our program. Now, there are situations that you need to loop a certain statement as many as the user wants. That's the difference between counter control and sentinel control loop, because a counter control, you are certain how many times the loop needs to perform, while the sentinel or the end of file or the other type requires user intervention. In this case, we have a program that allows the user to input data, and when the user inputs negative value, then our program terminates. So this will become kumbaga, we will not be using this condition anymore. Instead, if this statement is executed, we will go directly below the loop. So it will become a break loop. Okay? So yeah, that's the statement, or that's the example we apply when we apply the basically the example when do we use the break statement in our program. Okay? Okay. Next is continue. So in this example, we have a while loop. So we have condition that if a number is greater than 0 or 1 and above, So we will adding all the generated count, and we intend to allow the user to input again a number. So if the user inputs above 50, so your program will reset back to 0 and continue to the loop again. Okay, so for example, if the user input 1, 2, 3 and so on, but if the user inputs 51, so therefore it will be go back to another set of loop to input another value from 1 up to 50. So therefore, in this particular example, we only accept numbers from 1 to 50. If the user reaches 51 and above, so the data or the loop will be reset back to 0. So that's the purpose of continue. You don't have to break it, but continue to the next iteration. Okay? So, you might ask, sir, how this loop will stop? This loop will stop if you input negative 1 and below. Okay? So, negative 1 and below. Okay, so yun. Because the condition is always true if you input positive numbers. But if you put negative 1, so therefore, it will be terminated. You will be displaying the sum. Okay? So, let me check the chat box. Okay. 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 Next is okay. Okay, nested loop. So there are certain situations that you need to create a multiple loop, and sometimes those multiple loop become nested. So a nested loop is a loop within another loop. So you place one loop inside another loop. The inner loop is repeated for each iteration of the outer loop. There are several students that confused about this one. So let me discuss this as clear as possible. Okay, in this example, we have for loop here. So in this example, we have the outer loop and the inner loop. So how this loop is being executed? So in this output, as you examine, this is now your outer loop and this is now your inner loop. Which means when you execute a loop, it always completes the inner loop before continuing to the outer loop. Okay, so it's like this one. If you analyze this one, it go first to the outer loop. After executing this statement, it will go inside the inner loop and completes the cycle inside the inner loop. When the condition will become false in this for loop, it will go outside and go back to the first loop. So this first loop cycles 3 times, while the outer loop cycles 7 times, because days in 7 a week is 7. So this will become 7 times and this is 3 times. Okay, so therefore you have 3 times a week and 7 times the day, something like that. Okay, I hope it's clear. But the problem with inner loop, it allows your program to process slow. Okay, kasi syempre maraming inner processes inside, so nagkakaroon ng difference sa execution time. But of course, you need to identify when to use it. So when to use it, let's say for example, you need to read a certain number of data. For example, this one. This is now your data. We usually use this in our program in databases. And you need to read columns of data. So, for example, we have this data. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, 3 rows. So, this is now 3 rows by 5. So, you use inner loop to read each cell in this particular data. So the outer loop is this one by row, the inner loop is this one, the column. So that's the purpose of reading or inner loop, the usage of inner loop. Okay, I hope clear siya, no? So let's say for example we have examples here. Yeah, ito na pala. I did not provide a real example, so sorry. Anyway, you can look for another example on the internet. Just put keyword nested loop. By the way, nested loop can be a combination of for loop, while loop, depending on your needs. Ano po? It can be a combination of while loop or for loop or vice versa or do while or any type of loop. You can combine them. And of course, it doesn't mean use loop. You only need to use loop. You can also use conditional statement inside anything, combine the three sequential or the three structure like sequential, conditions, and loop together in one program. Okay. Okay, let's continue. Okay, now array. I guess some of you are familiar with this one because of the previous subject. So what is an array? An array, this is actually what in programming we call this array, not array, not array, array. An array is a variable that store multiple values of the same type, which means it's like a compartment and isang type lang or single type or single data type ang kaya niyang i-handle. So, some example, we have int x. So, you can store multiple values at the same time in one variable, which means variable x can handle several data at the same time. Okay, example, how do we declare them? So you need to declare data type, the name of the array, and the size. Example, int x6, which means the variable x can be created with 6 compartments. The difference between the int y, the ordinary variable, is y, you only have one value at a time. So when you say y equals to 10, the value is 10. So you can only change that by setting a new data. So it will become erased. This will become 12 because of the statement you provided in the assignment statement. So that is 12, something like that. Okay, so the final value is 12, not 10 to 12. Okay, now in this case the value of x has several compartment. 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 6. Okay, sobra ako. Okay, so you have 6 box that allows you to store 6 values. So let's continue. Okay, so this is how an array is being implemented. So if you have int x with 6 compartments, let's say compartment, or let's say cells. So your variable presented like this way. So if you want to access each compartments of your variable or array, we call that elements. This one, let's say element. This one element. Okay, elements. Generally in programming, we call that elements of an array. So this one is your first element, second, third, and so on. So to access an element of array, you call the variable name and the element index. We call that index or indices. This one is the index, which means if you call x index 0, you are looking for this one. Or if you are calling the variable x index 3, you are looking for this one. Clear? Array always starts in 0, which means if you declare x with 6 elements, this will become in elements, this will be n minus 1. Why? Because array starts at 0. Although it's always 6, but we always start at 0. Okay? I hope it's clear. So that's why when you call x 6, this is out of bounds. Why? Because we don't have elements that has an address of element number 6. Clear? I hope clear siya. Okay, so for example, how do we access elements of an array? So in this case, for example, you set the value of index 4 to 0, so therefore it will be stored in this particular element. So when you display the value of an array, you call the variable name and the index number. Let's say variable x element 1, so you are looking for this one. Again, if you call a value of element which is not part of the elements, let's say 7, it will return an array elements out of bounds because wala naman tayong x of 7. Okay? I hope clear siya. Okay, this is how you initialize an array. Okay? So when you declare variable x with 6 elements, something like that, which means all the value of the elements is 0. But if you want to declare the variable of an array with initial value, you can create an array like this one, which means all the elements in an array has initial value, something like this one. Okay, next. Okay, so in this example, we have an example program that declares 5 elements of numbers array, and in this statement, we have a for loop that allows us to input numbers and assign them inside the elements of our array. So in this case, we ask the user to input a number, something like this one. We put 11, 12, 13, 14. So therefore, in this case, every time the loop executes, it always accesses number depending on the value of I, which means when the loop executed, start from 0 up to 4. Since our array starts at 0 and n minus 1, so this is 1 is 0 element to 4, something like that. Okay, so for example, the value of I is 0, so therefore in this case you assign the input of the user to element 0, increment by 1, 1, and so on until it reaches I equals to 4. Okay, so it will be stored in array element, something like this one: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so this is now your elements. Now, how do we display contents of an array? Again, we use loop for convenience. If you don't want to use loop, you write this statement: cout the variable, let's say x, and you start with 0. For example, so you are going to write this 5 times. Okay? In order to display all the contents of the array. But using loop, you only need to execute one line. Okay, so therefore the output is like this one. Okay, so that's how easy you're accessing, how easy to access an array using loop. That's why loop is very important. Okay, now you can also access an array using for each loop. Okay, I think this is something new. Okay, the for each loop is used to access elements of an array quickly without performing initialization. So in this case, in our previous loop, we use for loop with initialization to 0 hanggang 4 and incrementation. This one, for each loop without performing initialization, testing, and incrementation. So it's a short method of for loop. The working of for each loop is to do something every element rather than doing something a number of times, which means the for each loop depends how many elements do you have rather than checking how many items does the loop has. So the concern of for each loop is looping inside the element until it reaches the element end of element. Okay, parang it's like end of file in a loop, but the difference is we access until the end of element. Okay. Okay, this example we have an array. So we have initializes to element 0 as 10, element 1 as 20, element 3 as 30, element 4 as 40. So which means we have a total of 4 elements in our array. So notice this is how a for each loop is being applied. Very, very short method. Now, of course, you initialize the value of x to be the value the element will be stored, which means when you access the value of loop, the value of the elements will be assigned to variable x. Then, of course, you can perform display of the value. So the output of that will be 10, 20, 30, 40, something like that. So I usually use this to access elements of an array rather than for loop. So it's a shortcut method. Okay. Okay. Okay, I think this is the time you are free to ask your question. So that's the end of my presentation. So if you have questions, please. I'm going to end my recording.